Hello and welcome. My name is Sofie Terwel. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak here today on the topic how registries are learning and changing, the perspective from the EBMT Registry. I'm an EBMT employee. I coordinate the Go-Kart Coalition, a multi-stakeholder initiative that was founded by EBMT and which I will introduce later in this presentation. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I've been asked to define learning objectives for this presentation. As the title suggests, the main objective is to show how registries are learning and changing by showcasing the EBMT registry as an example. So by the end of this presentation, you will be able to outline the three pillars of the EBMT and the main functions of its international registry. We will have studied the EBMT's experience with CAR T-cell therapies as an example of how real-world data can be used to support regulatory decision-making, and we will extrapolate the lessons learned from this example. So I will start by introducing the EBMT and the main functions of its registry. The EBMT is a not-for-profit organization. It's an international collaboration of healthcare professionals involved in clinical bone marrow transplantation and cellular therapy. The organization was established in 1974 by a small group of physicians that met each other every year on their skis in the morning, and then in the afternoon they would discuss some difficult patient cases to see how they could collaborate, exchange knowledge, and learn from each other's experience. And as of today, that network has grown a lot. So we have more than 6,000 members in over 620 centers in 75 different countries. The top 10 countries in terms of number of centers that contribute to the EBMT and its registry are mainly located in Western Europe. But we also have centers in all other European countries and beyond the borders of Europe in, say, Saudi Arabia, China, or Argentina. The EBMT is devoted to the promotion of knowledge associated with transplantation of hematopoietic stem cells or immunomodulatory cells, and we do that through three pillars. We have basic and clinical research, then we have promote education and patient care. The EBMT registry collects data on hematopoietic stem cell transplantation and immune effector cell therapies for patients with hematological disease. The EBMT registry currently holds over 770,000 transplant procedures. Each year, more than 35,000 new transplants are reported, and as of today, we have 3,000 CAR T-cell therapies registered in our database. This shows that the EBMT registry and other international registries alike can provide data from large patient populations. They collect data in a singular and harmonized way. This allows for the analysis of trends, but also compared to product registries, patient registries collect data on multiple treatment modalities and medicinal products, and thus provide accurate data for the evaluation and comparison of treatments. It's very important to note that centers that are EBMT members contribute their data voluntarily. Every member commits to reporting data on a core data set, and in addition, they may choose to report more extensive data on specific diseases, for instance, as this may be in the interest of the principal investigator of that center. Centers have direct access to their own data, so they can always use that to do their own studies. Of course, through the EBMT network and through the working parties that are the main responsible for organizing EBMT's educational and research activities, centers can get indirect access to the collective pool of data. If you are a member, you can come with a study proposal, submit it to one of our working parties, and then you get support to statistical support, data management support to conduct that study. And of course, centers, as I said, contribute this data voluntarily. So there's no carrots and sticks directly. Centers are not paid for the work they do. The only reward that they can get out of this, of course, is this increased or shared body of knowledge, and they can become authors on joint publications. The informal mantra of the EBMT registry is collect once, use often. And I see our registry as a multi-tool that can be used to support different functions. So first and foremost, we have the science and education. The centers, as I said, contribute their data, and our scientific studies are conducted by working parties, either within EBMT, but also in collaboration with international and national study groups. The working parties also organize scientific meetings and online or in real life courses. The registry is also very important for quality control and improving patient management. It helps towards standardization, and EBMT has JC, an accreditation organization that I will introduce in a few slides. We also support a benchmarking exercise since a few years, which I will also come back to later. Then in terms of safety surveillance, clinicians, but also increasingly other stakeholders like regulators and pharmaceutical companies see the value of the EBMT registry for long-term follow-up of safety and efficacy of certain products. And in addition to following up on patients, we also have a donor registry and follow-up on individuals who have donated their stem cells. The EBMT registry supports the function of our various departments, so a very short introduction to our main departments. Firstly, the clinical research department, it's our biggest department. Around half of our staff works in this department, and they support the studies that are conducted in collaboration or through EBMT's working parties. So the majority of the studies that are done within the EBMT are retrospective studies. And in total, this results in around 100 or more scientific publications per year. In addition, EBMT is involved in the conduct of prospective studies. These include both clinical trials and non-interventional studies, such as the EMA-mandated post-authorization safety studies that will be introduced later in this presentation. Then we have the Education and Events Department. They organize an annual meeting where I think we have around 6,000 people or more attending. Then there's various mid-size events and working party events to promote learning amongst healthcare professionals. And we organize webinars and e-courses. EBMT's third pillar is patient care, which is mainly promoted through JC. JC is the Joint Accreditation Committee of ICT Europe and EBMT, and ICT is International Society for Cell and Gene Therapy. JC was established in 1998 to promote quality of care in clinical collection and processing of stem cells through an accreditation scheme. Together with FACT, their counterparts in the US, JC develops standards, and currently we're at the 8th edition of these standards. These standards are evidence-based requirements set by an international team of experts, and they include requirements for both clinical and laboratory practices. The accreditation is then a means to demonstrate performance against these agreed standards of excellence. And a key component is the implementation of an effective quality management system. Currently, JC has accredited over 250 centers in 35 countries, with another 150 centers in process of accreditation. Annually, around 80 inspections are conducted, and accreditation is valid for 4 years. Our inspectors are volunteers that undergo an extensive training. They are for each accreditation procedure, 4 experts, different experts, so clinicians, collection and processing experts, and quality management go on site. And first, a center applies and basically conducts the checklist themselves to see if they are compliant and improve their procedures, and they provide all that documentation to JC. Then there's an inspection that goes on site, Then they compile that report. That report goes to the JAC, the accreditation committee. That's a way to organize, to ensure quality and consistency across inspections. Then the report goes back to the center for corrections, because only once a center has qualified and meets all quality standards, it can be accredited. Benchmarking can be defined as the process of comparing a practice performance with an external standard. In many healthcare settings, benchmarking for complex procedures has become a mandatory requirement for authorities, payers, and patients to assure clinical performance, cost effectiveness, and the safe care of patients. Hematopoietic stem cell transplantation is a high-risk treatment which requires a multidisciplinary approach. External quality review of transplant centers through accreditation by FACT-JC has become established over the last 2 decades, as we've just seen, and the adoption of these standards is associated with an improved survival outcome. Benchmarking has been integrated into the FACT-JC quality management standards since the 6th edition. And now the benchmarking exercise looks at survival outcomes following transplant. This includes overall survival, progression-free survival at 6 months and 1 year, as well as loss to follow-up. Data completeness has a critical impact on the validity of center comparisons, so this is also assessed. And what we've seen is a trend in reporting. So data quality for the core data that is used in the benchmarking exercise has improved over the last years. So benchmarking is really a tool for identifying poor performances and deriving corrective actions. So centers receive their results in a funnel plot, which is used as a tool for the center comparisons. And these funnel plots are based on the observed and expected ratio of unfavorable outcomes, say patient death in a center, and the performance of centers that fall outside the funnel may be considered to be significantly different from the benchmark, which is set at a 5% level, so either favorably or unfavorably. And currently the EBMT and JC are continuing with the development and refinement of the model. The data is currently anonymized, but in the future we may see that this data will need to be made publicly available, as is already the case in the US. In this second part, we will look at EBMT's experience with CAR T-cell therapies as an example of how real-world data can be used to support regulatory decision-making. Let me start by giving a short introduction on CAR T-cell therapies. CAR is an acronym for Chimeric Antigen Receptor T-cells. CAR T-cell therapies are advanced therapy medicinal products that are authorized centrally in Europe by the EMA. CAR T-cell therapies are an immune therapy that harness the patient's immune system to fight their cancers. A patient's blood is taken, then the T-cells are filtered out, and these T-cells are then engineered to express artificial receptors, which enable these T-cells to bind specific antigens on the patient tumor cells and kill them. So this therapy is currently approved for patients with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, certain types of lymphoma, and multiple myeloma who have failed 2 or more lines of treatment. CAR T-cell therapy is a personalized medicine and can be considered a living drug. It has a quite hefty price tag attached to it, but the results so far have been very promising. As I just said, in the EU, ATMPs, including CAR T-cell therapies, receive central marketing authorization by the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. As a condition for marketing authorization holders are required to conduct post-authorization safety studies to monitor the long-term safety and efficacy of these therapies. And in the current risk management plans, it's been agreed that these PASS studies are based on secondary use of EBMT registry data. This means that the standard registry informed consent form, our standard data collection forms and procedures are used to collect this data. And for this purpose, the EMA qualified the EBMT registry for collection of data to support the PASS studies. The qualification of the EBMT registry was part of an EMA initiative on patient registries, where it was acknowledged that patient registries are an underused resource for medicines evaluation and could be a potentially valuable source for data for supporting regulatory decision-making on medicines, although there were concerns about heterogeneity in design, data collection and its quality, as well to data sharing impediments. The way we look at this is that the future is not about randomized controlled trials versus real-world evidence, but that real-world evidence can really complement data collected in randomized controlled trials. So if we then take a look at the timeline for the qualification of the cellular therapy module of the EBMT registry, as said, it started with the EMA patient registry initiative that was launched in 2015. Then a year later, there were interactions between EBMT and EMA on how we could make our registry data available to support regulatory decision making. Then in 2018, EBMT got together with the EMA and various pharmaceutical companies that were active in the cellular therapy space to define what are the must-have data sets that should be included in the cellular therapy module. Then in August that same year, the EMA approved the first two CAR T-cell therapies for ALL and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And then in February 2019, the EMA issued a positive qualification on the cellular therapy of the module of the EBMT registry. And then in February 2020, so nearly a year and a half after the approval of the first CAR T-cell products, EBMT signed contracts with marketing authorization holders to support their post-authorization studies with the data collection initiative through its registry. And then in June 2021, the EMA process had been observed by UNETA HTA, so a similar process was being followed with the UNETA based on their request tool, and they really looked at the suitability of the EBMT registry to support the HTA process, and the results of this pilot were presented in June 2021. And then in August 2021, the contract with a third marketing authorization holder to support their PASS was signed. And then as we look at the number of CAR T-cell therapies that are registered in the EBMT registry, we see that those numbers are steadily growing. As of March 2022, more than 3,200 patients have been reported that have been treated with CAR T-cell therapies, and this includes both academic and approved and commercially available CAR T-cell therapies, and the majority of these cases are reported in West Europe. So this whole process required that EBMT adapted its processes to a wider context. And it started all with a growing awareness of the utility of the EBMT registry for other stakeholders. So we had to look beyond our normal processes and procedures with our working parties and open up to conversations with other stakeholders, as well as the scrutiny from other stakeholders. And that started, of course, with building relationships with these stakeholders, such as the EMA, DG Santé, pharmaceutical companies. It also really meant that we had to learn new languages. We didn't know what PLAG, post-launch evidence generation, health technology assessment, what was the PRAC. That was really new vocabulary for us. And it required us to update our procedures or to develop new processes. So a very important aspect was that the ICF had to be updated, so our informed consent form that we use for collecting data had to be updated to enable source data verification for the past studies, but also to allow sharing of pseudonymized data with marketing authorization holders in support of the PAS. And this is something where GDPR really, of course, was crucial. And the difficulty here is that because CAR T-cell therapies are personalized medicine, the EMA wanted batch data, so that's then a personal identifier at the level of GDPR. So patients had to consent to sharing their pseudonymized data with marketing authorization holders. And this meant that we had to update the ICF and implement a new ICF across hundreds of centers in Europe. And let me be clear here, for clinical trials, there is a harmonized framework for submitting and approving these type of documents. Of course, there's also harmonized requirements for clinical trials. This is not the case for registries. So if we're talking about non-interventional studies and registries, there's not a harmonized framework. So the requirements are set at national and often at local level, which really complicates this this procedure. And to be very honest, we underestimated the complexity of going to ethics committees and data protection officers, explaining this very new process of using a standard registry procedures to support post-authorization studies on very innovative therapies that led to a lot of questions and ultimately a lot of delays in the implementation of this new informed consent form. Then we had to harmonize our data collection forms with our counterparts in the US, the EBMT, so that data in the Europe and the US can be compared easily. We have established a patient advocacy committee and a patient engagement task force over the course of the last couple of years to really also harness that patient voice in our procedures. We are working on improving the interoperability of our registry. So we are participating in various EU projects and working on adopting the OMOP common data model so that it will be easier to link our data to other data sources. And another initiative that we have started is the launch of the GoCART Coalition. This is a multi-stakeholder coalition in the field of cell and gene therapies, where EBMT was the founding partner. The GoCART Coalition is founded by the EBMT and the EHA, the European Hematology Association. It's a coalition of multi-stakeholders. We work together with healthcare professionals, with pharmaceutical companies, with patient representatives. Where possible, we also link and interact with health authorities and payers. And the aim is to contribute to health and well-being through multi-stakeholder collaboration on clinical data, standards of care, education, and policy. The GoCART Coalition is a platform driven by the input of these stakeholders who may suggest and then jointly develop projects that advance the field of cellular therapies in Europe. Really, as I said, fostering collaboration, but also driving harmonization and efficiencies that in the end contribute to patient health. It's a very new initiative and coalition, but we have we organize our activities, as I said, in different work packages, and that may consist of several work groups. And I would like to show one example of the work that we have done that can also lead and show that it can lead to concrete results. So the starting point for the work group on harmonization of site qualification criteria was that the complexities of CAR T-cell therapies and their supply chains require pharmaceutical companies to qualify centers. However, as the number of CAR T-cell therapy products on the market and in the pipeline predominantly is growing significantly, centers are really confronted with an increasing audit workload. And the main aim of this work group was to evaluate existing site qualification standards, then to work together toward harmonization by leveraging these existing qualification schemes and ultimately reducing inspection workload on apheresis and treatment centers. And we started this work group with pharmaceutical companies BMS, Janssen, Kite, and Novartis. And as we published in March this year, and centers that are accredited by JC are now able to leverage their accreditation as part of the qualification processes of these 4 companies. And of course, there will be marketing authorization holders agreements and obligations, but it really means that centers that are holding JC accreditation will have the option of undergoing a reduced or remote audit focused on product-specific requirements for cell therapies only. And this is something that I think really shows the power of collaboration. And centers have also reached out to these companies saying, hey, I am JC accredited, and that can lead up to a 50% or more workload reduction. And in this last section of my presentation, I would like to go back to EBMT's experience with the CAR T-cell registry supporting regulatory decision-making and the lessons we learned. EBMT's interactions with the EMA were successful. We were the second registry to receive a positive qualification opinion, and to the best of my knowledge, we were the first registry to implement contracts with marketing authorization holders to support them with the conduct of their post-authorization safety studies. However, being the first also meant that we had to overcome a lot of hurdles, so it's not all rose-colored glasses. And I can really echo what was said by Thomas Salomonsen, the former chair of the EMAS Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use, that innovative treatments such as CAR T-cell therapies have the potential to change the outlook for patients with cancer, but they also come with new scientific and regulatory challenges. So some of the realities that we have seen over the last couple of years. Firstly, existing disease registries are not fully exploited, which leads to a duplication of efforts and efficiencies. The aim, of course, of the EMA Patient Registry Initiative was to make better use of existing registries, in this case the EBMT Registry, but what we see at national level is that certain authorities are mandating centers to report data to national registries, which leads to a duplication of workload for these centers. And just to give an indication, because I do think it's important to have that kind of reference, that an experienced data manager may take up to 3 or 4 hours to report the data for the baseline data for a patient with CAR T-cell therapies. So we're really talking about a big task here that centers need to do, certainly if they need to do this report this data twice. Then I think we need to be realistic in that real-world data can complement clinical trial data, but that quality will be more variable. This data is collected in a routine clinical care setting, so we cannot expect the same quality, as I said, but also not all the data that is collected in a clinical trial setting will be collected in the routine setting. Thirdly, there is no free data. Data entry by the centers as well as registry development and maintenance require financial resources, and it may not come as a surprise, but of course we've seen through the pandemic that resources were very scarce and everything had to be redirected to support the primary care process, which is really, this is all, it makes sense. But of course, data management is then the first thing to be taken off the list of tasks. And as a hospital, it's really difficult to make a case to get data management support because this just is not usually considered one of the priorities, although we subsequently do say that we need this data to make data-driven decisions. And as I've explained, I think the regulatory challenges include but are not limited to GDPR. This really has to do with this fragmented regulatory space in which registries, international registries particularly, are operating, where you need to be aware of the regulations in the different countries and often at the different center levels. And particularly in a space where we're looking at pseudonymized data versus anonymous data, of course, the requirements become much more strict, and the setting of doing studies, making secondary use of data rather than adopting primary data collection procedures is a real challenge, and we had underestimated that. And what we observe is that there's a tension between what, on the one hand, manufacturers and authorities want, not only regarding data and data quality, but for instance also regarding site qualifications, and on the other hand, what centers can reasonably do in a routine clinical care setting in a timely way. And some tension will probably always exist, but having a dialogue between stakeholders, I think, is essential to create an understanding of the requirements and the needs, as well as the practicalities on the ground. Not in order to reduce requirements, but at the minimum create this awareness that I said and an understanding, and where possible find ways to harmonize practices and requirements and ultimately administrative burden to ensure that energy goes to where it really matters most, patient safety. So I would like to conclude my presentation by highlighting again the importance of international registries to provide large sets of data in a harmonized way that can really support real-world data-driven regulatory decision makings. And registries are evolving and want to contribute to this. And like the EBMT example shows, we are willing to do the work to update our procedures and work towards improving the quality and consistency of our data. However, registries should not be considered cost-free data. Both data entry by centers and registry management just costs money. We really want to emphasize that effort should be placed on harmonizing the regulatory requirements across countries, but also the interpretation of regulatory requirements, for instance, in the case of GDPR. A dialogue between regulators, companies, and registry holders is essential to align expectations on both sides of the aisle, sorry, both with regulators and companies, as well as with registry holders and centers. And working together is a must in order to avoid fragmentation and double workloads for centers. And last but certainly not least, the scrutiny by external stakeholders has accelerated the process EBMT already started to improve the registry and related processes. And there are certainly challenges, but the overall impact is one of improvement. And with that, I would like to end my presentation. I thank you for your attention and I'm open to answering any of your questions.